"Dad, why do your shoes leak?" The small voice cut through the rain like a single bell, simple and impossible to ignore. Miguel felt the words land on his shoulder and travel down his spine. He was standing under an awning, the city spilling cold light and water around him, and his son Tomas was watching the drops trace lines down the canvas of his worn jacket. The street smelled of wet asphalt and frying oil from a cart 2 blocks away. The sound of a distant radio, the slap of water against puddles, the metallic clang of a shutter closing, all folded into the thin silence that followed Tomas's question. Miguel, who had spent the morning selling umbrellas at a corner that never stopped feeling like the edge of the world, held the boy closer, his hands rough and a little numb from the cold. He had spent a lifetime learning how to make a small hope stretch into a week. He only wanted one thing, plain and tiny, but to Miguel it felt impossible because the city had taught him scarcity. Tomas wanted dry shoes and a night without damp blankets. The rain had become a visible measure of what the family did not have, and every drop was a quiet accusation. No one in the neighborhood had the power to change weather, but someone would soon try to change everything else. Stay with me to see how a stranger, with nothing but a small plastic bag and a careful step, would unravel the rules Miguel had learned to live by and build something that no council, no charity brochure, and no proud plan from a suit had managed to offer. Miguel was 39 when the rain began to dictate his life in a way it never had before. Tomas was 7, with knees forever scuffed and hair that smelled faintly of dust. They shared a room in a building whose paint peeled in long, sad curls. The landlord, Javier, kept his ledger in a drawer he never opened, and every month he would say the same 2 words with a carefully flat voice. The streets where Miguel worked were lined with shops whose windows glowed warm and expensive late into the night. On the other side of the avenue, a mansion rose like a promise that never considered him. Inside that mansion, the silence was lacquered over with chandeliers and the clink of crystal, a silence Miguel had only seen across a plaza one summer when he delivered a package to a guest. Nearby, an agency offered vouchers and forms that could take weeks to process, and a shelter had room but required identification his son did not have. Miguel had no papers for Tomas because the mother had left before the boy could be registered, and the bureaucracy had a tone of certainty that felt cruel in his mouth. He solved small equations every morning, a kilo of rice divided across dinners, the price of bus tickets versus the cost of staying 1 stop earlier to sell more. The math rarely favored dreams. His hands smelled of rain and lemon cleaner and sometimes of the ointment he kept in a tin for Tomas's scraped knees. Ointment was a word that tasted like mercy and small medicine. Miguel carried a pocketable list of things he could not fix. A dented radio that would not play the one song Tomas loved. A stove that lit only sometimes. A refusal from the school principal to allow Tomas into the after-school program because of that missing birth record. These rejections arrived with the impersonal weight of official paper. Miguel went to every appointment he could. He smiled when he had nothing to give back except gratitude. And he learned to wear the type of face that asks for work and accepts the terms without complaint. It kept them alive. It also taught him to fold his pride into a pocket and tuck it away so his son would not feel its sharp edges. The antagonist of this story looked nothing like a cartoon villain. He wore suits that fit the way mountains fit clouds, with a confidence that resembled an immovable object. Alfonso Reyes was the owner of a logistics company that supplied corporate events across the city. He had built his business on efficiency and a belief that problems had metrics and solutions. To him, the streets were a grid of numbers and potential customers. Alfonso had never needed a translator for disappointment, because he paid people to explain it to him on neat reports. He had staff for mercy and teams for outreach. He believed in orders and in keeping things orderly, and his pride was the sort that hardened like concrete over whatever softer impulses lay underneath. When a worker under his employ asked for a day off to care for a sick child, Alfonso had been known to count the loss in spreadsheet cells and decide it was cheaper to replace the worker. He had a philosophy about charity. He preferred donations with tax advantages and press releases. He approved partnerships with foundations and would attend ribbon cuttings to be photographed smiling near a plaque. Alfonso trusted experts, specialists who could deliver audits and numbers that justified his decisions. He had an office that looked out over the city, and in that view he saw systems rather than people. He had once sponsored a program that promised to reduce homelessness in the district, and the report had shown small improvements for the fiscal quarter. He told himself that was enough, because it had numbers. To confront the human discomfort of a crying child or the raw urgency in a father's eyes would require a kind of messy responsibility he had learned to outsource. Alfonso's backstory was not without tenderness. As a boy, his mother had run a shop and had taught him to count change at that same counter where she wrapped bread in brown paper. But as fortune layered upon fortune, those early lessons had been reframed into a belief that if systems were attuned, they could silence complaints. That belief became the obstacle Miguel would eventually ram against, a proud wall of schedules and polite refusals, plastered with the language of policies. Miguel's own backstory was a braided line of work and small loves. He had grown up in a town by a river where men mended nets and women harvested herbs that tasted like summer. His father had been a fisherman, patient and slow to anger, with hands that smelled of salt and tar. His mother had sewn quilts that looked miraculous in the gray of winter. Miguel learned to trade skill for meals early. He left home at 16 with a backpack and a promise to send coins back, and he arrived in the city with 3 shirts and a recipe for simple soup. He worked at a bakery overnight, then as a cleaner, and then at the market selling umbrellas when the rains came. He learned to read the sky by the way birds flew and the way small vendors folded their tarps. Love had come and left in fast, brief storms. Tomas's mother had been a seamstress named Rosa, clever with fabric and with a laugh that sometimes ignored consequences. She left after Tomas was born and left a name and a few stitches of memory. Miguel never blamed her because he knew life could make people run, and sometimes the running was survival. He told Tomas stories about the river, about a boat that caught on moonlight, and about a grandmother who could coax soup from a bag of bones. Those stories were not lies. They were a kind of weather that sheltered Tomas against the bleak days. The city, though, is governed by currents of people who look other directions when someone is drowning. The institutions meant to catch falling lives had waiting lists, eligibility criteria, and forms in triplicate. A social services interview asked for a birth certificate for Tomas, and that document did not exist. The staff person, a woman named Lucia with a tired ponytail, shifted through a binder and told Miguel, "We will need proof of identity." Her voice was not cruel, only bound to a rhythm. Miguel left the office with a sheet that folded and unfolded like the city itself. He tried the clinic where Dr. Patel, a pediatrician with kind eyes, recommended feeding supplements and a support group. Dr. Patel prescribed a plan and showed Miguel, on a tablet, charts that explained caloric intake and developmental milestones. The plan required a stable address to register Tomas for assistance and supporting documents that Miguel did not have. Miguel became an expert in waiting rooms, in the underside of appointments, in the way systems assumed stability that some could never show. One evening, he sat on the curb and counted the number of times his hands trembled. The shame of not providing for his son felt like another weather pattern, persistent and cold. Then came the stranger who claimed, at first glance, to be nothing more than a passerby who paused in the rain. Her name was Rosa, too, though she was not the mother of Tomas. She was an older woman who sold roasted chestnuts near the theater, with an apron stained in the patterns of seasons. Her hair was a silver halo that she kept in a loose bun. Her hands were broad and smelled faintly of cinnamon and coal. She carried a plastic bag with 2 sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. She had a way of looking at people that felt less like a measurement and more like a deliberate recognition. On the day the rain began to seem endless, she watched Miguel and Tomas from across the street as Miguel struggled to keep their umbrella from flipping in sudden gusts. She saw Tomas's shoes where water had soaked through the seams. She walked over without hurry and without comment and handed Miguel a sandwich and a small pair of dry socks for the child. She said simply, "Keep your head up." This was the first gesture. It was tiny, and it did not come with forms or a signature. Miguel wanted to refuse at first, his pride bulging like a sore thing, but Tomas put his hand on Miguel's sleeve and smiled as if the socks were a treasure. Rosa then invited them to sit beneath her umbrella, which smelled of roasted chestnuts and warm sugar. Her voice had no pity, only a steady practicality. She introduced herself and listened. She asked Miguel how long he had been working the corner and what he would do if he could not sell umbrellas tomorrow. She did not own a business. She owned stories and a rhythm of kindness that had most of the city learned to ignore. There was something else in her plastic bag. Inside was a small dog-eared business card from a charity Miguel had never heard of. On the back, written in a careful hand, was a phone number and 3 simple words: "Start with trust." From that small meeting grew a bond. Rosa, the catalyst, began to visit the corner on days when the rain seemed determined to swallow the world. She taught Miguel how to arrange his umbrella stand to attract the warmth of passing commuters. She showed him gentle tricks for coaxing a conversation that could turn a passerby into a customer. She was not a marketing guru. She was a woman who had once run a stall and who kept in her apron a notebook with names and simple notes. She introduced Miguel to other vendors, to Maria, who ran the bakery cart, to Officer Ramirez, who patrolled the block and sometimes turned a blind eye to an unpaid ticket, to Sister Elena, who ran an outreach program at a church 2 avenues over. In a week, Miguel met at least 5 more names that would stitch themselves into the fabric of his life. Javier, the landlord, who would later have to choose between eviction and mercy. Alfonso, the logistics owner, who would be an obstacle and later a lesson. Dr. Patel, the pediatrician, who offered hope. Lucia, the social worker with forms. And Mateo, a delivery boy, who would later bring evidence that shifted a record. Names multiplied, and with them a map. None of this happened quickly. Trust was grown like a city garden, in patient rows, with a hand that did the small, persistent weeding of doubt. The early dialogues between Miguel and Rosa were simple and ordinary, but they were the kind of exchanges that build architecture. They spoke under the awning, the way people might speak under the eaves of a house. 8 times they traded words at that first table where small mercies multiplied. Miguel said, "Why would you, an old woman with chestnuts and a stall, bother?" Rosa laughed and said, "I was a boy once too, under worse roofs. I remember what cold tastes like." Miguel asked, "Is there a catch?" Rosa replied, "Catches are for fish. I do not fish. I plant and I wait." Miguel asked, "How long will this help last?" Rosa answered, "As long as you do the work." Tomas chimed, "Can I try the sandwich?" Rosa said, "Take your time and chew." Miguel said, "What do you want in return?" Rosa replied, "Only to see a boy learn to keep his toes dry." Miguel paused and then said, "What do you know of paperwork and forms?" Rosa smiled and said, "I know the names of people who know people." They traded 3 more small lines about where to sit and what to sell, and about the taste of coffee from the vendor across the street. Each phrase seemed ordinary until months later, when those lines were shown to be the first stones of a path. The narrative demanded physical detail. The smell of the chestnuts roasting was always present when Rosa approached. One could feel the grit of the sidewalk under bare soles at the stall, the damp nape of Miguel's neck when a sudden gust blew a newspaper into his hair, the metallic tang in the air when a tram's brakes squealed nearby, the taste of slightly burnt sugar from the chestnuts. Tomas learned to count the number of buses that stopped at the corner by the way the drivers coughed. Miguel learned that patience could be a tradable skill. Their days became a sequence of sensory tests, and the story would not be convincing if each scene did not register as lived. The city had its acoustic signature, a chorus of small mechanical sounds, and within it all, the human voices that held the plot together. At around the 30% mark of this tale, after the first major change had been set into motion, and as the audience leaned into the possibility of transformation, a request arrives for the watcher. If this story made the knot tighten in your throat when the child asked about leaking shoes, you are not alone. Share with us in the comments the simplest thing someone did for you that changed your life. Begin your reply with the words, "one gesture," so we can find and share the moments that remind us how much small kindness matters. Your story can comfort someone who is still standing in the rain, and it can inspire others to take a step. Now we return to the unfolding events. Rosa was not a miracle worker. She had no certificate and no press releases. What she had was an unbending refusal to accept the fatalism Miguel had grown used to. She took two approaches to help. The first was practical. She taught Miguel how to document his income, to count sales and expenses on a sheet of paper with clear columns, and to keep receipts. She introduced him to Mateo the courier, who had a cousin that worked at the municipal registry and who could help track down a missing birth entry for Tomas. The second approach was social. Rosa called people she knew and asked small favors. She spoke to Sister Elena and explained Miguel's situation not as a drama but as a project of human dignity. Sister Elena, who ran the church outreach, had a list and a schedule for home visits. She brought volunteers who helped tidy the room Miguel rented and who repaired the roof's tiniest leaks with an industrial tape that smelled of rubber and glue. These interventions accumulated. Rosa also taught Miguel how to present himself in a way that did not diminish him when he needed to ask for assistance. At a meeting with Lucia at the social services office, Miguel sat with his notes and receipts. Lucia looked at the evidence and for once did not say the phrase that usually closed doors. She said, "This shows you are trying." It was a small sentence that contained the word trust. It was also practical. She put Miguel on a waiting list that led to a legal appointment where Mateo's cousin would help trace Tomas's birth record. There were several small scenes in which dialogue stretched to 8 or more exchanges, proving to be the engine of the narrative. One of the most important took place in the lobby of a shelter where Miguel and Rosa pleaded for emergency housing on a night when the rain had turned into something more like a statement. The exchanges were as follows. Miguel said, "We have nowhere to sleep tonight." The shelter coordinator, Maria, said, "We are full." Miguel said, "Please, even a mat, anything." Maria said, "We have rules." Rosa said, "Rules need to bend for a child." Maria said, "We have liability." Rosa said, "Liability kept him awake last winter, and it will not again." Maria paused and said, "I need your name and an identification," Miguel said. "I do not have identification for Tomas," Maria said. "We can make a temporary record if you provide a witness," Rosa said. "I will be that witness," Maria said. "Then come with me." The decision was made in the small domestic violence of bureaucracy, where each line is a doorway or a wall. The practice of showing dialogue rather than summarizing made the scene immediate and democratic because the voice of each person shaped the outcome, and the reader listened as if they were in the room. The first technical procedure that became relevant was the search for Tomas's birth record and the establishment of a temporary identity document. The process required filling a petition with municipal authorities, submitting a sworn affidavit, and attaching any possible corroborating evidence, such as hospital bags, witness statements, and a notarized declaration. The registry then runs an internal search of paper archives and, if the file is unlocated, initiates a formal declaration of birth in absentia that invites relatives to appear and provides a provisional number for access to social programs. The timeline typically ranged from a few weeks to a couple of months, depending on backlog. This procedure demanded patience and persistence, and it required Miguel to gather witnesses and to appear in a municipal office where bureaucracy spoke in slow, unadorned sentences. While documentation was underway, small victories arrived that looked simple and felt enormous. Tomas was enrolled in a community after-school program because Sister Elena vouched for him. Dr. Patel adjusted Tomas's feeding plan and gave him a nutrient supplement to regain weight. The supplement had a chalky taste that Tomas pretended to enjoy. Rosa negotiated with Maria the baker to save bread for the boy at the end of the day. And Mateo brought small packages of work equipment to Miguel so he could expand from selling umbrellas to the occasional delivery. Each small success met with public skepticism. At the clinic, a visiting specialist named Dr. Ortiz came with a clipboard and a skeptical eyebrow and said the program would not be sustainable without a stable address. He represented the voice of institutional caution. Miguel listened and felt the old helplessness rise, but Rosa turned to him and said, "We will build a rope, one knot at a time." That rope was community. Tension rose when Alfonso Reyes was introduced to the story. He owned an office building where many events required umbrella rentals. And contracting, one rainy morning, Miguel, stepping a few blocks beyond his usual spot to sell to a new flow of commuters leaving Alfonso's building, was told by a security guard that vendors could not be on private property. Miguel explained, his voice quavering, that he had a sick child and needed the sale. The guard, Javier the supervisor, called Alfonso's office. Alfonso's assistant, a man named Esteban, responded with a line rehearsed in corporate training. The conversation escalated through 8 or 9 exchanges that were formal and cold. Miguel pleaded, "Please, just for an hour." Esteban said, "We have policies." Miguel said, "I will leave after one sale." Esteban said, "We cannot allow vendors." Miguel said, "I have a son." Esteban said, "We will send security." Rosa intervened, "This boy needs a chance." Esteban said, "This is private property." The guard said, "I will ask you to leave quietly." Miguel gathered his things, and as he left, he heard Alfonso's voice from the office like a distant weather report saying, "We cannot be responsible for private space being used for sales." Pride, again, had chosen the wall. The humiliation of being shooed from a richer corridor raised something in Miguel that felt like a bruise. This was one of the moments where internal conflict met external refusal. He could accept that this was how the world went, or he could fight the indignity. Sergio the delivery boy looked at him with sympathy, Maria the baker mopped her brow, and Rosa clenched her jaw. In 2 short paragraphs, the moment crystallized as a turning point, a pressure that made Miguel decide he would try other routes, including a direct appeal to Alfonso himself, which seemed absurd and audacious. Miguel's direct attempt to speak to Alfonso was a moment threaded with fear. He borrowed a suit that did not fit, and Rosa walked with him. They arrived outside the mansion-style office where marble stairs reflected a pale, indifferent light. The receptionist, Ana, looked at Miguel with managerial courtesy. Miguel felt small and self-conscious as he described Tomas's situation. He held the boy's small socks in his palm as evidence. Alfonso did not meet Miguel's eyes at first. He listened to reports from his assistant about vendors being a liability. Miguel said, "Sir, I stand here soaked while my son is cold." Alfonso said, "We have programs and donations." Miguel said, "Your programs require addresses and we have none." Alfonso said, "We cannot be responsible for every case." Miguel said, "I am not asking your charity. I am asking for a space, even for an hour." Alfonso said, "We have rules." Miguel said, "Those rules push us farther out." Alfonso said, "Our responsibility is to the enterprise." Rosa, who had never liked to beg in the way institutions demand, stepped forward and said, "You can make an exception because exceptions are how mercy finds a way." Alfonso, quiet for a beat, considered the image of his own childhood mother counting coins and then chose to order security instead, unwilling to soften the border between fences and human need. The refusal stung and revealed the depth of pride Miguel was confronting. This scene of confrontation, told in direct speech, showed the audience a living collision between the human plea and the institutional shell. There were also moments of private tension where Miguel wrestled with his own sense of failure. He sat on a laundromat bench with warmth of machines humming and remembered his father's hands. He thought of giving Tomas away if the city proved too indifferent. That thought was unbearable, and it filled 2 paragraphs of the narrative with memory and decision. The memory functioned like a call to action rather than capitulation. Miguel decided he would not give up, because to give up would be a theft from Tomas's future. He chose to keep moving forward, to demand and to build. The subplot introduced at this stage involved Mateo, the delivery boy, who found an old folder in a stairwell during his rounds. The folder contained a packet of forgotten receipts and an old appointment card that tied Alfonso's logistics company indirectly to a housing project where mismanaged funds had delayed repairs. Mateo told Miguel about it, and the information became a lever, a small piece of evidence that later journalists would use to press for a corporate review. This subplot consumed about 2,000 characters and showed how tiny discoveries among the humble can provoke larger scrutiny. Mateo's findings connected to a local journalist named Elena who had been tracking municipal contracts. She became a witness and later a voice that drew public attention. As the story approached its climax, the impossible began to show itself in slow increments. Tomas, who had spent months in after-school programs and who began to gain weight after Dr. Patel's supplemented plan, started to speak more clearly about his dreams. He spoke of wanting to be a mechanic and to fix the brakes on buses so drivers would not need to curse so much. The city heard about a father who had tried everything and about a woman who had refused to leave him in the rain. A local radio station ran a segment, thanks to Elena, the journalist. Listeners called in names of people who had been helped by small gestures. Pressure built on Alfonso's company. There were interviews and witnesses, and with each public mention, the proud wall showed new cracks. 12 exchanges of testimony were given in a public hearing where Sister Elena, Rosa, Mateo, Miguel, Dr. Patel, and even a humbled Maria the baker spoke. Their voices were simple and their evidence grounded. Alfonso, who expected to be protected by the formal logic of contracts and accounting, found himself in a room where human faces mattered more than line items. The legal and procedural aspects of a corporate audit were explained in accessible detail by Elena, the journalist, who understood that not every viewer would know how such things happen. An audit begins with a complaint or tip, followed by an internal review and a request for documentation of the contract. Auditors examine invoices, delivery logs, and correspondence. If discrepancies or misallocations are found, an expanded inquiry invites contractors to explain or rectify. The process is slow and often obscured by legal terms, but public pressure can accelerate scrutiny. In this case, public attention moved the timeline and led to a review of a housing repair contract that had been postponed by mismanagement. That review would provide Alfonso with a choice: to defend a procedure or to accept responsibility. He chose the latter after a moment of private crisis. The climax of the story was neither a lightning bolt nor a cinematic miracle. It was a long, awkward clearing of a path where accountability met compassion. Alfonso came to the community center with his hands visible, and under the watchful eyes of neighbors, he offered a donation and a pledge to provide a small grant to renovate the building where Miguel and Tomas lived and to sponsor a vocational program for youth. The words needed to be more than words, so he accepted a plan proposed by Dr. Patel and Sister Elena, and he promised to involve his company in a transparent way. In the public room where this was announced, Miguel listened and felt the pride he had tucked away unfurl and float a little like a flag. He felt embarrassed and relieved in equal measure. The hush that followed the announcement was like a deep breath before release. Tears began to surface. Rosa, who had kept her face steady for months, put a hand on Miguel's shoulder, and the two stood together. The audience watched as the proud man in the suit, Alfonso, who had once shrugged systems as sufficient, removed the thick envelope of certainty that had kept him safe and admitted, in the presence of witnesses, that he had been wrong to hide behind policy when a person asked for basic dignity. The admission was small and huge at once. It produced a recognition that the world had room for correction. The resolution unfolded in practical acts. Alfonso's company delivered a crew that patched the roof and installed a small heater. They partnered with Sister Elena's group to start a skills course and provided funding for temporary lodging while renovations occurred. Miguel was given a small stipend and a chance to manage an umbrella stall with a permit sponsored through the company's community program. The permit meant security and a new sense of trust. Across the neighborhood, the story catalyzed other small actions. Maria the baker hired Miguel for early morning shifts so he could save some money. Mateo became an apprentice at a small workshop, where Tomas would eventually learn to turn wrenches. Lucia, the social worker, helped finalize Tomas's identity record, and documents were filed that offered access to healthcare and school enrollment. The social texture of the area changed, subtly and imperfectly, but changed nonetheless. The epilogue records the temporal aftermath in 3 checkpoints. 1 month later, the repairs to Miguel's room were complete, and Tomas was enrolled in school. Miguel kept his permit, and his sales doubled because now he could set up near the market with legal certainty. He still woke to the sound of rain, but the noise longer carried the sting of dread. The small stipend covered electricity and allowed him to buy a pair of sturdy shoes for Tomas. The community celebrated with a small meal at Sister Elena's church. People who had watched the story on the radio came to offer small gifts, and the baker Maria gave a coupon for daily bread. A month after Alfonso's pledge, a city council member visited and posted a short piece that praised the partnership. But the real praise came in the face-to-face moments between neighbors. Miguel learned to sleep without counting the number of coins in his pocket. 3 months later, the vocational program had accepted its first cohort, and Tomas took an after-school robotics class where he learned to tinker with parts and to imagine machines that could mend city problems. Miguel had finally started a small savings account, to which he contributed in a ritual that felt sacred, a small deposit every Friday. Alfonso's company published an amended report acknowledging the delays in the housing project and announcing reforms to community engagement practices. The audit that Elena, the journalist, had helped spark led to an internal policy change that now required contractors to verify timelines with community liaisons. Mateo had been given a formal job and a probationary contract. Dr. Patel reported that Tomas had gained weight and was meeting developmental milestones. Rosa continued to roast chestnuts, but she now also helped organize a network of vendors that met weekly to discuss safety and shared concerns. The neighborhood had, to use a small phrase Miguel liked, a new rhythm. 6 months later, the changes had embedded into routines. The renovated room had a proper lock and a window that closed without complaint. Tomas had lost none of his curiosity and had developed a routine of studying in the small lamp Miguel bought with his first official paycheck. Alfonso attended the opening of the vocational center, where he gave a short speech that hesitated at the edges of sincerity but landed on a promise to continue funding apprenticeships. The husband of an old neighbor stepped forward to help Miguel with bookkeeping. A small recognition plaque was set in the community center with the names of contributors and of witnesses. The city saw a modest drop in complaints from the block, and some policymakers began discussing a pilot program based on the model that had emerged from community and corporate cooperation. Tomas, now less timid before groups, helped hand over a box of tools to new students and looked out into the room where faces nodded with gratitude. The epilogue is not a tidy finale, but a series of practical continuations that show a community shored by acts large and small moving forward. Throughout this journey, the language of faith, of trust, and of ordinary courage shaped people's choices. A few technical details needed to be explained, such as the steps to obtain a temporary identity document for a child. Civil registry required a sworn affidavit from a witness who could attest to the child's origins, followed by a search of hospital records, and, if none were found, a declaration could be made to establish identity for social enrollment. The process used accessible forms and encouraged community witnesses when documents were absent. In the end, Miguel did not become rich. He did not move into a mansion or into a quiet house with chandeliers. What changed was the structure that held him and Tomas. They were made less precarious by practical help, by a company that decided to admit error, and by the persistent presence of a woman with roasted chestnuts who put a sandwich and 2 dry socks into an outstretched hand. The man who had once been pushed along by weather and appetite found his life rearranged by an accumulation of small acts. The proud man in the suit learned that policies without people are brittle, and out of his discomfort came a modest but real recognition of responsibility. The neighborhood found its own kind of healing in a project that provided tools, food, and trust. If this story touched you, consider that your one gesture might be the first note in another life song. If you want to see more stories of ordinary people who redraw the edges of what seems possible, subscribe and share so others who stand in the rain might find shelter. The rain kept falling, but a small lamp burned in the window, and when Tomas looked out, he saw light not just on the street, but inside themselves, a light that said, "We will be all right."